heart of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath towering temple walls and burning desert skies, a ritual was said to take place that shocked even the ancient world. Foreign writers claimed that every woman in Babylon was required, once in her life, to sit in the temple of a goddess and offer herself to a stranger. Was it sacred devotion? Was it propaganda? Or was it a myth powerful enough to reshape history itself? What we think we know about Babylon may rest on a story written by its enemies. Tonight, we separate ritual from rumor and uncover why this story refuses to die. To understand the controversy, we must first understand Babylon itself. Ancient Babylon rose on the banks of the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq. By the 2nd millennium BCE, it had become one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the world, an empire of law, astronomy, architecture, and trade. Its skyline was dominated by temples and ziggurats. Its rulers inscribed laws into stone. Its merchants connected continents. But Babylon was not only political power, it was spiritual power. At the center of its religious life stood the goddess Ishtar, known also as Inanna, deity of love, fertility, war, and cosmic transformation. She embodied contradiction, desire and destruction, creation and conquest. In a world dependent on agriculture, fertility was survival. Crops, livestock, heirs, everything depended on divine favor. And so sexuality was not hidden, it was sacred. But somewhere in this sacred landscape, a story emerged, one that would outlive Babylon itself. The most famous account comes from Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. He claimed that in Babylon, every woman had to sit in the temple of Ishtar at least once in her life and have intercourse with a stranger as an act of sacred obligation. The man would toss a coin and invoke the goddess. Only then could the woman return home. Herodotus described it as law, mandatory, unavoidable. To Greek readers, this was scandalous. It portrayed Babylon not as refined, but morally inverted. But here is the tension. Herodotus never lived in Babylon as a resident. He relied on hearsay, travelers' tales, and political rumor. And his account stands almost alone. Babylonian inscriptions, thousands of them, speak of trade, land, rituals, offerings. They speak of priestesses, marriages, dowries. They do not describe compulsory sacred prostitution. So how did this story become history? In Mesopotamian religion, sexuality was symbolically tied to divine renewal. There was a ritual known as the sacred marriage. In some periods, the king symbolically united with a high priestess representing the goddess. This act was not casual. It was political theology. The union dramatized cosmic order. It affirmed the king's legitimacy. It promised fertility to the land. But this ritual was elite-controlled, symbolic. Over centuries, outsiders conflated symbolic rites with sexual excess. Language barriers compounded confusion. Temple attendants were labeled prostitutes by Greek observers unfamiliar with Mesopotamian categories. The Greek term Herodolos, sacred servant, became translated as sacred prostitute. Translation shaped memory. Political rivalry deepened distortion. Greece and Persia were adversaries. Babylon had fallen under Persian control. Depicting Eastern societies as morally corrupt reinforced Greek identity as rational and civilized. The story served a purpose. It made the other inferior, dangerous, and once written it spread. Why do such stories endure? Because they fascinate. Sex and religion, combined, ignite imagination. They blur boundaries between sacred and taboo. They provoke moral superiority. Ancient audiences consumed such accounts eagerly. So did later ones. When early Christian writers encountered pagan traditions, they amplified these narratives to contrast Christian virtue with pagan decadence. By the medieval period, Babylon had become symbolic of corruption itself, a metaphor for spiritual decay. The alleged ritual was no longer a description, it was a weapon. It justified conquest. It justified moral judgment. It justified rewriting the past. And the real Babylon, its laws, mathematics, literature, faded behind scandal. In the 19th and 20th centuries, excavations began in Mesopotamia. Archaeologists uncovered administrative tablets, hymns to Ishtar, temple records, legal contracts. They found detailed regulations governing priestesses. Many sworn to celibacy. Others held property rights. Some engaged in ritual roles, but not in the manner described by Herodotus. Scholars began re-examining the sources. Was sacred prostitution institutionalized, or was it a misunderstanding amplified by cultural bias? The turning point came when historians realized that nearly all detailed descriptions traced back to Greek or later Roman authors, outsiders with political motives. Meanwhile, indigenous records remained silent on compulsory sexual rites. Silence is not proof of absence, but patterns matter. Gradually, consensus shifted. The idea of universal temple prostitution in Babylon became highly contested and in many circles rejected. The ritual that had defined Babylon in popular imagination began to dissolve. Why does this matter? Because historical narratives shape civilizations. Babylon became shorthand for decadence. The image influenced Renaissance art, biblical interpretation, colonial rhetoric. The phrase, Babylonian corruption, echoed for millennia. A single claim, repeated enough, became cultural truth. And yet, the real Babylon pioneered law codes under Hammurabi, advanced astronomy, developed early literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Its complexity was reduced to scandal. This is how power operates, not only through armies, but through storytelling. When conquerors write history, nuance disappears. To be precise, ritualized sexuality did exist in parts of the ancient Near East. Fertility rites were real. Symbolic unions occurred. Temple personnel served varied functions. But the claim that every Babylonian woman was forced into sacred intercourse lacks corroboration in native sources. What likely existed was a mixture of ritual symbolism, temple service roles misunderstood by foreigners, voluntary practices exaggerated into universal law. History is rarely simple. It is layered, contested, filtered through fear and fascination. Yes, the story's endurance reveals something deeper than ancient ritual. It reveals how easily a culture can be reduced to caricature. When societies are labeled immoral or primitive, intervention feels justified, conquest feels righteous, cultural destruction feels necessary. Babylon was conquered repeatedly by Persians, Greeks, Parthians, but long before its ruins crumbled, its reputation had been rewritten. What survives in memory often matters more than what survives in stone. So what was the sacred sex ritual of Babylon? Perhaps it was real in some form, ritualized, symbolic, contained. Perhaps it was misunderstood. Or perhaps it was magnified into legend by those who needed Babylon to represent everything they feared. The deeper question is not whether one ritual occurred. The deeper question is this: who controls the narrative of a civilization? When power shifts, stories shift. When empires fall, their reputations are renegotiated. History is not only written by the victors, it is imagined by them. And sometimes what they try to erase is not the ritual itself, but the complexity of the people who lived it. Babylon still stands in ruins, but the story about it is still alive, and that may be the most powerful ritual of all.